Lakshmani Vishnur Ahani Ubecha Tadbro Vijrimva Parameshti Dishnyam Tadbro Vijrimva Parameshti Dishnyam Aposyatalo Rasa Eva Jiva Aposyatalo Rasa Eva Jiva. Yorakshini Chakshura Bhutpatanga Vijrimba Parameshti Dishnam Aposyatalo Rasa Eva Jiva. Yo, the sphere of outer space. Akshini, the eyeballs. Chakshu, of eyes, senses. Avut, it so became. Patanga, the sun. Pakshmani, eyelids. Vishnu, of the personality of Godhead. Shri Vishnu. Ahani, day and night. Obey, both. Cha, and. Tat, his. Bru, eyebrows. Vijrimba, movements. Parameshti, the supreme entity. Brahma. Deshnam, post. Apaha, Varuna, the director of water. Asya, his. Talu, palate. Rasa, juice. Eva, certainly. Jihva, the tongue. Translation. The sphere of outer space constitutes his eyelids, and the eyeball is the sun as the power of seeing. His eyelids are both the day and night, and in the movements of his eyebrows, the Brahma and similar personalities resides. His palate is the director of water, Varuna, and the juice or essence of everything is his tongue. To common sense, the description in this verse appears to be somewhat contradictory, because sometimes the sun has been described as the eyeball, and sometimes as the outer space sphere. But there is no room for common sense in the injunctions of the Shastras. We must accept the description of the Shastras and concentrate more on the form of the Viradrupa than on common sense. Common sense is always imperfect, whereas the description in the Shastras is always perfect and complete. If there is any incongruity, it is due to our imperfection and not the Shastras. That is the method of approaching Vedic wisdom. Om Jnana-timirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmritam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavangscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagna Raghunatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagna Lalita Shri Vishakanvitangscha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurange Radhe Vrindavanishvare Vrishabhanu Sutta Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyaeva cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. The sphere of outer space constitutes his eyelids, and the eyeball is the sun as the power of seeing. His eyelids are both the day and night, and in the movements of his eyebrows, the Brahma and similar supreme personalities reside. His palate is the director of water, Varuna, and the juice or essence of everything is his tongue. So, a very interesting description of the Viradrupa continues. And you see in this purport then Prabhupada saying something that is very difficult for any modern person to appreciate. This idea that common sense is not as important. And why is that? Well, because we see that common sense is something that is shaped by the time that we live in. So what is now common sense, it wasn't common sense 100 years ago. And 100 years before that, it was also different. So we see that common sense, for example, at a certain point, so many things are normal. Slavery at a certain point was normal in society. It wasn't strange. People thought that it was common sense, that this is how you organize society. And now we see in modern society, many people think that eating meat, for example, is not such a strange thing. It's common sense. You have to eat meat to get protein and whatever. So in all this way, common sense is therefore never a proper way to approach the truth, because it is shaped by just the time in which we are living in. And the time in which you live in, we all know that there are naturally imperfections in human society. So while we all use common sense on a day-to-day basis to sort of find our way within this world, you have to deal with reality on a day-to-day basis, and we also have to deal with the world we are living in, the people that are here, and the time and place in which we are living in. But at the same time, common sense has to have a secondary place. It's not the most important thing when one starts to approach Scripture, because it is especially when Scripture challenges our idea of common sense, our idea of what is right or wrong, that then we have to be able to put that aside and say, well, somehow or other, this is what the Scripture is saying now. Now this is not such a difficult thing, this is just a little more of an abstract description of the Viratrupa. So then this contradiction is perhaps not something so challenging to our conception of what is right or wrong. But we all know, we have read certain things in the Scripture, certain things that are contentious, that is difficult for us to appreciate. In the beginning, it is just the basic idea that sense gratification cannot make us happy. Common sense won't allow you to understand that, unfortunately. And most people's common sense is directed exactly towards the opposite. That it's obvious that what would make us happy is a comfortable material position. So that is one instance where Shastra challenges our common sense. Then we have so many things that are difficult to understand and that pushes us. So therefore, I've sometimes heard devotees, they challenge or they find it difficult to read Prabhupada's books because it feels, some of them have very many reasons. But oftentimes it is because Prabhupada's books are just very clear, sort of just very, not belaboring the point of beating around the bush. He just says things clearly in a spirit of fidelity towards Scripture. And then it somehow hits the heart and it challenges one. And then one has to be honest and able to digest it, as one could say. Now, so that is then what they call the science of philosophy. It is called hermeneutics, the means by which one tries to interpret Scripture, or interpret spiritual literature, or literature in general. But then obviously in the religious traditions, that is very important. How exactly is it that we understand the Bible or the Scripture? So we see in many Christian churches, there's so many different ways in which people have found a way to understand the Bible. Is it figurative? Is it literal? Is it just a metaphor? Or is it the absolute truth? Was the world created in 6 days? And in this way it causes people there's a lot of confusion regarding that. But you see that Prabhupada, he is very interesting because he simply accepts Scripture as it is. This is his famous phrase that he coined. But this understanding that one has to enter into the spirit of Scripture by not having this challenging mood, but by understanding that this is correct, this is revealed knowledge, and now but it is not that the intelligence has no role to play. That is not a fact. So sometimes people would misunderstand, saying that now you have to put your intelligence aside, or that in the absorption of Scripture, that you just have to be like a child in the sense that you do not have to think critically about anything. But that is not a fact. The role of the intelligence is to understand how this is true. So not whether it is true or not, but how exactly is it true. Yes, I understand now. Scripture says that this is how it is. But then by one's intelligence, one has to understand how this is the fact, and how exactly does this all work together? That is the role of the intelligence. So the intelligence is meant to support faith. So by faith we accept something, and then the intelligence helps us to understand how exactly it works. Why is this like this? Krishna's instruction, one has to have faith in the instruction of the spiritual master. The spiritual master gives us an instruction. And then that instruction is what it is. But then by our intelligence, we have to find out, we have to think, why is this good? Why should I do this? And this way understand. The more deeper one can understand the why behind it, by virtue of one's intelligence, then also one's faith will be supported by it. And in that way, we also become personally convicted, personally convinced about a certain point. So that is something that we can also do whenever we do read or encounter certain principles in Scripture. So many things are there. Gender relationships, social organization, so many things that are different than what we might have been brought up in. And whenever these things they challenge us, then we should use our intelligence to find out more about it, to try to understand it better, to really think about it a little. In that way we can actually also overcome doubt by the help of the intelligence. So instead of the intelligence being something that blocks us from entering into Scripture, it can become something that helps us to really research it. And we will see that any point in Scripture, or most points that Prabhupada would raise, for example, that might be, or that the Scripture brings out, that might cause us doubts or challenge our beliefs, if we go research it, we will see that there are also many other people who are in agreement with us about how the world should be structured. For example, Prabhupada would speak about how monarchy is better than democracy. So that's difficult. Not so many people would agree with it. But then we see there are actually many different philosophers and arguments for explaining how this is the case. So this is an example of how one can do some research, increase one's understanding, and in that way come to a deeper appreciation of the points that Prabhupada is making, whatever it is. So all doubts have to be addressed. That is important. That's the important point. Whatever doubt we have, in many forms, whatever way, shape or form it comes, one has to address these doubts and not just let it linger in the back of one's consciousness. It has to be brought out to the front, and it has to be somehow addressed, as Krishna explains to Arjuna, that you have to slay your doubts with the sword of knowledge. So it's not that doubts necessarily can be treated quickly. Some doubts one has to move through with time and experience, but it is important that one can move beyond it and slowly to integrate all these things into one's life. And even if there is an instruction of a spiritual master, one has to have become convinced that this is what I am supposed to be doing. This is what will make me happy. So in any case, that is the nature of subordinating oneself in front of Scripture. And that is the spirit that is required to enter into it and to understand it. And it is that spirit that will also allow us to understand Krishna's instructions, and in that way be able to follow it in full conviction. Okay. Any questions or any comments? Yes. Exactly. Very interesting point, yes. So, well, let's first see now, definitely Scripture can be misused. That is obviously also the big problem that the modern world has with Scripture, is that they're fed up with it because, say, for example, at least the Western world, in the name of the Bible, so many things have been done in the name of the Bible. So people are just forget about the Bible. It can be used. It's not a useful means of deciding what should be done, because it can be misused by so many different people. And the Vedas are also no different. Vedas, so many things can be, on the basis of the Vedas, so many things can be implemented. And then one can say, yes, this is it. So therefore, and now you're saying that we see that one has to also use one's intelligence to catch, to see, is this really true or is it not true? So common sense, as Prabhupada uses it here at least, means, as we said, that it is not that common sense has no purpose, or intelligence has no purpose. So first thing, common sense is where we, at least as Prabhupada uses it here now, is like, it's just a specific kind of argument on the basis of superficiality. So superficiality, or understanding things just how the world sees it now. So in that way, intelligence that is just formed by the current time in which we are living, or in that sense, that's a specific way in which the intelligence is used. But then, as we said, intelligence has a very important role to play in scripture, definitely, even when understanding Prabhupada's instructions or the instructions of Krishna. And like say, if you would look at the first canto of Bhagavatam, then we see when Arjuna caught Ashvatam, and then we see that there Krishna told him that you have to kill him. Krishna and Bhima told him you have to kill him, according to scripture, isn't it? This person is the slayer of your children, and therefore scripture dictates that he has to be killed, so therefore you have to kill him. But then we see Draupadi said, no, you cannot kill him, because he is a Brahmana, and scriptures dictate that Brahmanas should not be killed, isn't it? So then he was caught between these two positions. So then he was like, what do I do now? Because scripture is telling me both these things. So in the purport, Prabhupada points out that yes, a devotee, just because one is a follower of scripture, it doesn't mean that one doesn't have to use one's intelligence. It doesn't mean that one is freed from having to figure out exactly how it works. Because your scripture is supposed to, one could say, ultimately infuse one's intelligence. Your intelligence starts to function based on what you have received from scripture. You see also, and there you can see Arjuna had to make a decision. So he still had to decide what should be done. And on the basis of that decision, then he would still be judged. He would still get a reaction for it. In terms of, see, that's how it goes. So, and that was very interesting. And then Prabhupada says here, that is the nature of the devotee. See, that the devotee, Krishna gives him the intelligence by which he can understand what needs to be done. But not necessarily so that, because even Krishna there didn't tell him exactly what should be done. Arjuna came to the point, he says, okay, well, what I will do now is I will satisfy everyone. I will kill off Ashvatam's lock of hair and his jewel, but at the same time I will spare his life. So in that way I will satisfy all the injunctions of scripture. I will satisfy Krishna and I will satisfy Draupadi. So that was intelligence. So there we can see an example of real intelligence that is utilized in approaching scripture and approaching the desires of Krishna. So, in the mode of passion, you see that ultimately, if you would look at, our understanding is that equally as important as the words of scripture is the consciousness of the individual that has to become properly receptive to understanding scripture. So therefore we say that a Brahmana, there's certain things a Brahmana cannot do. Four regulative principles, for example. Why is that? Because the four regulative principles, if one doesn't follow these things, one will be contaminated by passion or ignorance. And then one can never understand the scripture. So that's the other thing. The consciousness of a person actually has to come to a point where he can then properly understand scripture. Otherwise he will misuse it or abuse it or not properly understand how it works. So as the consciousness becomes infused with more sattva gun, then it becomes more clear what exactly should be done. One becomes able to integrate all the various injunctions and all the different perspectives that has to be done. And therefore, there's also brahmanas of different classes. So there's a brahmana who is faithful to scripture, but then you also get certain personalities that are greatly enlightened, greatly wise, because their consciousness is very elevated. And therefore they can, like Prabhupada for example, we could see that Many people are spiritual masters and spiritual teachers, but then someone like Robert is a very unique person because his understanding of Krishna's desire and his ability to apply the perspective of the Bhagavatam was just extraordinary. So in that way, we also have our own, we have to be able to become receptive to Scripture. So therefore, we see that there is the Guru, the Sadhu, and the Shastra. So these three things work together, because from these three things, it will help check any possible misuse or abuse, and also help us to use our intelligence. But it is important that we can never switch off our intelligence. So some people, in the beginning, people think that that is the solution to me being able to become a proper disciple, or to properly surrender unto Krishna, is that I should switch off my intelligence, and then in that way I will just be able to do exactly what I need to do. But that is not actually how it works. That is when, if you look at a cult, people sometimes, that is a cult. See, that is cults. A cult is where they somehow you enter into that group, and then by various ways they get you to switch off your own intelligence, and then you just have to listen to this person, and you just completely sort of, a part of your mind, it just goes off, and then you don't discriminate for yourself anymore what is right or wrong, and you just follow that. But that's not actually how it goes. There's a nice letter, very nice letter that Prabhupada wrote to one of his disciples, Kurandar. At that time, they were making this attempt to centralize ISKCON. So like now, if you look at how ISKCON functions, all temples are independent. So we have our temple established, we're established as an independent legal entity. We make whatever funds we raise, that we use to support our temple, and we also use that to preach in our local environment. So then at a certain point, let's say many businesses, they don't work like that. So the biggest businesses in America, for example, say if you look at Walmart or all these businesses, they don't work like that. Many of them, they're centralized, meaning that you have, say, 1,000 branches all over America, but all that money, it goes to the same place. And then from that place, that money is again distributed. And in that way, it's controlled by some central board. So they wanted to do that, to centralize ISKCON financially and also administratively and legally. And Prabhupada is very much against it for a few reasons. Firstly, for legal reasons, because then now, say if we make a big problem, if we are sued, it's only this temple that goes down. Like say if there's a big accident or something and then we get sued, if we have a civil lawsuit, then we are just an independent entity. So then even if we lose a $10 million lawsuit or a $100 million lawsuit, what will happen is just this temple will close down and then it's over. But if the whole society is connected as a whole, then it means the whole society is liable. So therefore, if you lose a $200 million lawsuit, then they will take this temple and they will take other temples also, because you're one entity. So very interesting that so Prabhupada could see, rather have it independently organized. But his actual main point that he said that the purpose of ISKCON is to create people that are independently thoughtful. So intelligent people that can think for themselves, basically. He said that's the goal. So he said, rather have in each temple, let them organize themselves, because then they all have to understand how to do it. They have to understand, everyone there has to, by their own intelligence, they have to raise their own funds, they have to take care of theirs themselves, they have to learn how to preach themselves. So otherwise you would create people that are dependent. So then you have some head office in Washington, D.C., and then they send money each month to all the temples to maintain them, and then you would just have a bunch of lazy people that are not able to think for themselves or be independently active. So Prabhupada's vision also is that one has to have people that are independently thoughtful. And a Brahminical person is also supposed to be someone like that uses his own intelligence to understand what needs to be done. So he doesn't switch it off, but rather his intelligence becomes infused by Krishna's instructions. And then he becomes a source of inspiration for others. So we see that Guru, Sadhu, Shastra. But, so there's the scripture, and then there's two people. There's the sadhus, and then specifically the spiritual master that help us understand it. But what that also means is that you also have to become part of that. You have to also become a guru and a sadhu for other people, to help them also to understand by the proper practice of Krishna consciousness. Your own intelligence becomes infused with that. So, and how do we do that? A part of that is sincerity. So the sincerity, like Krishna explains in the 10th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, how those who worship Him sincerely, He gives them the intelligence by which they can come to Him. But then there's another point which is also just experience. So experience. So, certain things we will see that as we practice Krishna consciousness for a number of years, then we start to realize certain things by experience, certain ideas we had at a certain point. Like for example, there is Sridhar Swami. So Sridhar Swami, very nice. He also spent quite a lot of time here in New York City. And very nice devotee. I don't know if you ever listened to his classes. Listen to Sridhar Swami before? So he's also called the Jolly Swami. And he was from Canada originally, but he's a very big person. He used to be a wrestler. And he spent a lot of time, in New York and also with a lot of time in Mumbai and Juhu. So, in any case, he was just, gave his whole life to Prabhupada, and at the end of his life he got some kind of liver cancer, I believe, stomach cancer, liver cancer, and in any case he passed away, but he was very transcendental, even at the end. So it was clear that he was a very greatly realized personality. But at the later end of his life, what he started to do is, when he became much heavier and his health was not so powerful, then he started to, for the first time, after being in ISKCON for 40 years, or whatever, he started to take care of his health. Yeah? And then I was reading it was an interesting class when he was speaking, and then he said, he doesn't regret anything in ISKCON. He just gave everything to Prabhupada. But the only thing he would do different, if he would join again today, is he would just be much more careful about his health, because he says that it just wasn't something they thought about. But now, only 40 years later, they can see, oh my God, this is actually a little worth it, to do some exercise, to check your diet. So that's an example of just experience. So just by experience, then you learn, oh wow, this is interesting. I never thought about it. My intelligence, someone didn't pick that up. I just thought that, forget about it, I'm just going to do it. So it's a simple example, but it's an example of just learning. So similarly also, let's think about another example. Another example of my own spiritual master who was shot. So then he said that after that, he really thought about it, because the person, or the people that did it, were those people that were very unhappy with him. So he said that before that, as a manager, when he was managing, he was always thinking that the goal is to do what is reasonable. So there's like something that is reasonable. And you would really think about what is reasonable, and then if you could see that, well, this is the most reasonable solution that we need, then what he would do is he would just push to have that happen. And if people don't like it, then it's their problem. What can you say? But after this experience, he realized that actually no, that's not the most important thing. He says now when he deals with devotees, he tries to think, how can everyone be satisfied? Which is a very different approach. It's like completely different. When you have a group of people together and and they have a problem, and you think what is reasonable, that's one thing, and it's important to think about it. But to also start thinking, well, at the end of this meeting, whatever decision has to be made, or whatever we do, it has to also somehow satisfy all the devotees. So that is something that came after 30 years of management, and he had this realization. So that's also a part of Krishna consciousness, that we learn through experience. So Krishna gives us certain experiences and then we learn. And we said, well, actually interesting. For a long time I thought it was like this, and now Krishna revealed to me that it is like that. So therefore the devotee always stays very humble, and he always ultimately prays to Krishna to please help me make the right decisions, because we know that even at this moment, there's so many things we are thinking, so many beliefs we have that might be changed in the course of time, and that even now may be causing us some difficulty. So, but generally we see that, at least for my own life, I've experienced that at each phase of my life, I would see that there's something specific one is working on. I see it also with many devotees, and generally it is like that. See, because we can't do everything at once. But generally I'd see that there's a specific something that Krishna is trying to teach us. at a specific moment. It's something that we have to learn. And if we can just try to, and when we try to say, okay, this is it, this is what I have to learn now, then in that way we see that Krishna sort of has a lesson plan for each one of us. So, and in that way, if we can just sort of catch what it is that Krishna is trying to teach us at this moment, and in this way also actually then the intelligence becomes fortified. And then when we use scripture, we are able to bring our own experience also with it. But we see that it is only experience that is connected to the desire to please Krishna and that is guided by the devotees that will lead to this kind of knowledge. It's not just by experience that one learns, because there are many people in this world who also live for 100 years and they don't learn these things. So that's important to understand, that it is by combining the desire to understand Krishna's desire and by being guided by the devotees, that then, along with experience, then we more and more start to understand how scripture works. But we should then, even now, be careful to think that to use scripture as a tool without humility, because then we can oftentimes cause damage to other people and to ourselves, thinking that we are justified by scripture. And that happens because of immature understanding. And specifically, we see what causes a lot of difficulty in the modern world is to understand how spiritual hierarchies work. This is a big problem. If you see now in the world, what is two of the main issues in the world today? It's the relationship between men and women, and the relationship between the higher classes and the lower classes, the rich and the poor, or those who have power and those who don't have power. And we see it's causing big problems. So many movements, it's all about that. It's about who has power and who has not power and how they're supposed to be dealt with. And then the gender relationships are the same. So then we see examples in scripture how scriptural relationships, or at least the Shastra, always has this conception of a hierarchy. So we see that is causing very difficult to understand it. Like who is in power and who is not, who should decide and who should not decide. It's causing great havoc in the world, and even for us to be able to apply it as an example of people that, of something that can only be applied with great understanding. Because many people would complain that the society that is described by Krishna is something that is oppressive. The Brahmanas are on top and the Sudras at the bottom, and it looks like the Brahmanas are oppressing the Sudras. You see, so, but then if we really get into the spirit, then we see it's not like that. The Brahmanas, for example, they're supposed to serve. So therefore, it is that element of understanding that seniority in scripture means a greater responsibility to serve. That's actually what it means. And a decreased potential for enjoyment. So, but that is something that it takes a great maturity to understand these things. So, but we see it as difficult. And the world outside, complete havoc. People not understanding when we say that whatever, woman should be, a wife should be subordinate to her husband, for example. You read it, people go mad because they think this is just a recipe for oppression. And then we have to understand. You see what I'm saying? So with all these things, scripture cannot just be applied like this, because then people can misuse it. And now there was this interesting letter with Prabhupada. One person writes to Prabhupada, he says, "Should I understand that my wife should listen to me in all respects?" And then Prabhupada said, "Would you be so, what did he say? So arrogant?" I said, "Would you be so arrogant to expect that?" Yeah? Very interesting. But you see that obviously he misunderstood that idea. In any case, some reflections on how this is supposed to work. But therefore we have to look towards the mature Vaishnavas. That is important. That is the trick. To look towards mature Vaishnavas, because it is in their life. What is that verse? Krishna also says that the path is hidden within the hearts of the devotees. It's not just in the scripture. You won't find it in scripture yourself. The path is hidden. Sadhu, what's that? You know that verse? Sadhu Hridayam Patu. Find it somewhere in the 9th canto, somewhere in Bhagavatam. You can't hear. Somewhere, I'll find the verse. And I'll send it to you. There's a verse where Krishna says that, like Dharma. There's a verse in Mahabharata also that explains how Dharma is hidden within the hearts of the devotees. So it is not just in the book that one can get it. It is through the heart of the devotee, through the heart of the realized Vaishnava, that we can then understand how it works. And therefore we always stay a little, how can we say, we are always open to correction, open to adjusting our understanding by the senior devotees, because we know that there are many things that we might not be able to properly see right now. Any other question? Thank you for that question, because now the class is not 20 minutes long. Yes.
Maybe you have some kind of suggestion or way how to deal with these kind of situations. Because sometimes the situation happens and you will just.
Which situation?
When devotees, for example, use scriptures just to kind of bring people there or feel uncomfortable, and you just notice it. So what's the best way to?
Well,
For example, you can understand that this was the speaking with you, right? But the other person cannot understand that. And you're gonna like push him or
yeah. Well, firstly, we might see that maybe we have to really consider maybe if the other person is right or not. That's the first step. Because it is, if you would see that, obviously if someone will use, say if we have a wrong understanding and someone uses scripture and they will reveal that actually we are not properly understanding, then it will make us very uncomfortable and we will maybe feel guilty and a little bit embarrassed. So therefore we have to first really be able to say, well, is this person maybe not correct? That's the first step. One has to be open to understand, well, if someone says something based on scripture, we have to really think, well, maybe it is correct. Maybe we have to really give it proper thought. But then we have to never be afraid of people if they are not correct. Like say something like criticism. There's no need to fear people's criticism. Because if their criticism is correct, well, even if it is painful, it is very wonderful. Because it is true. What can we say? If people point out maybe even if they do it in a very harsh way, that's not a problem. If it is correct, then it is good for us. If it is not true, then what's the problem? If someone criticizes you for something that is not real, then also there is no reason to fear it. Because then if it's not true, then it's not true. If someone says that, yeah, you are a liar, but you didn't lie, then, what can we say? I mean, then the truth will ultimately, it is explained that that's how it works. If one is following Dharma, even if one is being criticized by other people, one doesn't have to worry, because the truth will come out. If the truth is really that you have stuck to the principles of Dharma, it is guaranteed that at a certain point it will be revealed. So therefore one doesn't have to fear. So therefore firstly one never has to fear in that sense. So even if someone explains something, we can really fully consider, well, is this true or is this not? But then if we see that someone is not proper in their understanding, which oftentimes happens, because in our movement, we are also a movement that we always allow other people in. It's a movement of being open to other people to come and also to become developed. And then we'll see, oftentimes, yes, there will be an immature understanding of scripture. And that immaturity will maybe cause some whatever, here or that. And there's no reason to be so disturbed by it, because then we have faith that even if a person has maybe a slightly immature understanding of scripture, but at the same time, they are actively engaged in devotional service, then we have faith that, well, this engagement in devotional service will purify them and bring them to a higher conception. For example, there was one person who wrote a letter to Prabhupada, and he was complaining that he met some of Prabhupada's book distributors on the street, and these book distributors were so negative about the material world. They were just preaching to this person how horrible this place is and whatever. They were just very negative. And this person wrote to Prabhupada with great concern, and he said that, if the result of your people following is that they become so negative, then he says it's not good, you cannot have people so negative. So then Prabhupada wrote this person a letter back. I don't know if you ever saw it. But he said that, firstly, it is true that these people, he says, actually what you're saying is true, A Vaishnava it's not just like that, It shouldn't, he says that, but they have just now recently taken to the spiritual life, so therefore, and they're still attracted somewhat to the material energy, so therefore to defend themselves, they become now very negative to sort of adjust to the situation. He said, but we also have to understand, but at the same time, they are strictly following, so they are strictly following the process, they are making a sincere effort, for example, to distribute these books, and therefore they will be purified, and very soon they will become mature. So therefore Prabhupada had this vision. I recently saw a letter with one of his disciples. He wrote to Prabhupada telling Prabhupada that he wants to become Jagat Guru. He wants to become a guru of the whole world. And it is so interesting because obviously that is such a horrible mentality, to think that you want to become the guru. And it is obviously something that, one could try to smash it out. But Prabhupada told him, what did Prabhupada say? It was very interesting. What did Prabhupada tell him? Prabhupada told him, this is actually a very horrible mentality to have, to think that you want to become guru of the whole world. Prabhupada said, no, that is okay. He says, if you want to be a guru for Lord, no problem. But he says, but then your behavior has to be flawless. So then Prabhupada says, well, if you want to become a guru, no issues. But then you have to follow very strictly. So meaning that Prabhupada had faith that if he will continue following strictly, he will be forced to become humble at some point, because that's the nature of sincerely practicing Krishna consciousness. So therefore, what is the problem with ambition? So many ways we see that we have to, the goal of this movement is to help people become purified. And it is only by purification that people can properly understand scripture in a mature way. But we might not be able to purify people immediately by our words or by force. So that is the nature, because the false ego is a very sensitive thing, isn't it? So one cannot just go in there and try to cut it out or rip it too much, because then the result will not be so good. So just like if you deal with children, for example, you cannot just tell a child, if you see a child has a bad mentality, like I once went to there were some devotees that had a birthday party, and then the child was there, and then they all brought gifts for the child, and then the child just freaked out because other kids were also playing with his toys. And then at a certain point he grabbed all his toys together, and he was standing in the corner of a room with his back to everyone. It was very embarrassing because he didn't want any one of the other kids to touch or play with his toys. So then what do you do with a kid in that condition? You can rip the stuff away, and then you can cause a great trauma. But if you deal with a child, you have to understand that, well, it will take a little while for this child to now become mature enough so that they can share freely. So also when we see these things, we have to have faith that we have to be patient enough to see that by engaging in devotional service consistently, it is possible for people to become more mature, and in that way, then they will be able to see things properly. So not to become too disturbed by some of the superficial things, because the more important thing, and therefore you can see that Prabhupada's main consideration in dealing with people was their some form of a service attitude. In some way or other, they are willing to render devotional service. For us at least, that remains our most important feature. It's the most important thing, because it is that service that will bring people closer and purify them. If someone is not at all interested in devotional service, then we could see Prabhupada says, let him go. Even if he is greatly intelligent, or even if he's greatly cultured, whatever it is, but if he's not interested in rendering devotional service, then please go find somewhere else. You can go somewhere else then. But if that interest in performing service is there, then we can work with it. And also, just as a final note, by ourselves, if we are actually properly compassionate, which is explained to be that is one of the primary qualities of the Brahminical class, Brahminical people, spiritual leadership, is that one is really genuinely interested in the well-being of other people, then you will see that people will also be more likely to trust you. And if a person, even if he is immature, we see that the immature understanding and application of scripture is because people are doing it independently. But if a person trusts you, then they will naturally ask your advice and naturally be open to your suggestion. So therefore, if a person is not trusting you, if a person doesn't trust you, it is then that they will use their own intelligence and do so many things to throw at you. But if someone trusts you, then they will be more willing to be guided. So therefore, it is also important that people that they can trust, and then they will be open to suggestion. Now, I was answering your question, considering that the immature application of scripture comes from people that are new, so people that are maybe newer in Krishna consciousness, which I was thinking that was what you were meaning. Okay, so that's fine, because then it's a whole other world when you have people that are very senior, but that also that is a whole different question. But at least we try to deal with this situation. Okay, it is 9 o'clock. Can you believe it? Śhrīmad-Bhāgavatam ki jai. I just realized